Welcome to the lecture 4 of ARC 494. Today's topic is ecology and ecosystem. Um, so if we look at the content, we are in the third tier where today, after ecology and ecosystem, we will talk about the structure function of ecosystem with carrying capacity. So it's important to understand the definition of ecology. Ecology is the study of living organisms in the natural environment, how they interact with each other, how they interact with their non-living environment. So ecology is the relationship between organism and environment, which is coined by Haeckel and Tansley. So some terminologies are important to understand ecology a bit deeper. For example, ecology. Whenever we study on individual species or population within the ecological setting, then we call it ecology. For example, if we consider Royal Bengal tiger population in our mangrove forest, so it's about ecology. Then sign ecology is the group or community of an ecosystem. For example, if we consider the mangrove forest system of Bangladesh, then we can call it as sign ecological study. Then ecological succession is the process of change in the species structure over the time. So starting from a bare rocky stone environment to a climax community, developing to a climax community. This is over time, there is a process of succession of, that means the change of structures and typologies of species. This we call ecological succession. Ecological niche is the physical and functional role of a species in a community. For example, in an ecosystem, there might have a lot of species and they are particularly connected to each other for their functions and physical existence. That is part of the ecological niche. An ecological equivalent is the similar ecological niche found in different geographical regions of the world. If we think about ecological succession a bit more, we can see this picture that starting from the bare rock to the shade tolerant trees. So this is the development, chronological development over the time from pioneer stage to the climax community development. This is called the ecological succession. So it's a progress of change in an ecological community. It can be the primary or the secondary succession, but eventually the idea is to have the climax community. Then, based on the temperature and rainfall of a particular region, this world has been divided into 6 different biomes. We call it biomes. It's a big region with similar temperature and rainfall scenario. So the first one is the tundra, is utterly bitter cold and covered by snow and ice. So we can find the permafrost there. So eventually, hardly you will find big plants, so small grass and mosses can grow there. Then we can shift to coniferous forest, which is also called as taiga. So coniferous came from the cone bearing trees, so you will find pine tree there. So it's a we're talking about cold climate, dense forest, but the sunlight cannot reach to the ground. So in this scenario, animals such as squirrel, moles, birds, and insects live there. So to the deciduous temperate forest is eventually it is the forest where in the summertime it can be hot, but in the winter time it's cold. It's a dense forest habitat. Different habitat for animals can be found there. Tropical rainforest is the excellent weather for growing plants and soil development. We call all the thick and tall plants can grow in the tropical rainforest. And tropical rainforests are situated along the equator, supporting more plant life. So the diversity of species, zooplanktons, phytoplanktons is the maximum in the tropical rainforest. Then we can elaborate a bit about the grassland. Mostly the difference between deciduous forest and grassland is Grassland doesn't receive much rain, but the climatic weather for in terms of temperature is similar to the deciduous rainforest. But as long as it's not sufficiently receiving rainwater, so it's not sufficient to grow for example, grow trees. In desert, we know very dry, receive little rainfall, hot during day, cold during night. Soil is dry and poor in terms of nutrient. So not all the species and plants can grow in desert environment. So some terminologies are important for us to also understand ecology. So for example, species. What we mean by species? Species is a group of organisms that can breed to produce fully fertile offspring. Sometimes there is a difference or exceptions. For example, tiger and lion can crossbreed and it can create liger, but this is not the usual case. So in usual case, all the similar species group of organisms, those who are can offspring have the fertile offspring, we can call them as specific species. In terms of population, whenever we go for the study of ecology, then it is important to define the population. So the population says the group of organisms of the same species which live in the same habitat at the same time where they can freely interbreed. That means group of organisms, same species, it has to be same species living in the same spatial location or geographic location, and they can freely interbreed. We call them as population. For example, black-veined white butterfly population, or tiger population, or squirrel population, so for so on. Then it's important also to understand what is biodiversity and what is habitat. So biodiversity is the total number of different species. So it's not the single species or group of single species, it's rather total number of different species in an ecosystem and their relative abundance and how they interlinked, how they coexist together in a given spaces is called the biodiversity. It can have different species altogether, and it can have one single species with different typology of the breed can form the biodiversity as well. For example, this butterfly has different types of butterfly found in a specific biodiversity, can also create or enrich the biodiversity element. Habitat is the area where or environment where organisms usually live. For example, in deciduous forest, we can find this stony stream, and this stream can be the house of different fish stock and trees in it. So it creates the habitat. It's not about the structure where they live specifically, but also how they live, how they interact with other species being in the same space. That is also important to consider in habitat. Now, the second part of today's discussion is about ecosystem. So ecosystem is considered as an unit which consists of all living organisms functioning together in a given area. So it has to be a certain area where all the living organisms are functioning together and interacting with the physical environment. That means the abiotic environment in a manner whereby flows of energy leads to clearly defined biotic structures and cycling of materials. That means nutrient flows between living and non-living parts is known an ecosystem. So we need to think about ecosystem is a certain unit where living organisms functioning together, and they have the relationship with the physical environment as well to transform the energy and the material, or transfer the material. That means nutrient cycle, energy cycle should exchange in between, and then we can call it as an ecosystem. So this term is coined by Tansley, and it can be a very small and it can be a very big, smallest structure and functional unit of nature. We call it ecosystem. So ecosystem can be also termed or defined as a smallest structure and functional unit of a nature. And this ecosystem can consist of both biotic community and abiotic community and their close interaction. It is also important to mention that there is an interaction among physical and living organisms, living world, in terms of energy and nutrient cycle. The interbiosphere can be considered as the global ecosystem. The characteristics of ecosystem, we can, based on the origin, ecosystem has two different parts, is the natural ecosystem and the man-made ecosystem as a type. So man-made ecosystem, we can easily understand the crop field or an aquarium. This is kind of a man-made ecosystem. How crop field is a man-made ecosystem? Because we always think about monocropping system. For example, you are sowing maybe jute, or you are sowing corn. So this field of corn is created by human being and is called the human made ecosystem. Natural ecosystem can be pond ecosystem, we call it terrestrial. Whenever we call it terrestrial ecosystem, we consider forest, grassland and desert. Aquatic ecosystem is considered as pond, lake, wetland, river and estuary. In terms of within the aquatic ecosystem, it can be a two-way around. For example, aquatic ecosystem based on the running water, we can be lotic, it can be lotic ecosystem. That means fresh water is running, there is a stream and river is part of lotic ecosystem. And lantic ecosystem is the stagnant water we have. For example, pond, swamp, ditch, this sort of ecosystem, we call it basically based on stagnant water system, we call it lantic ecosystem. Then we have this typology of ecosystem based on the size. If the size of the ecosystem is the entire biosphere, then we call it mega ecosystem. If the size is about, for example, a tropical rainforest or the deciduous rainforest, we can call it a macro ecosystem. We have a micro ecosystem is called, for example, ecosystem of a pond, and we have nano ecosystem. One drop of water can have can create its own ecosystem with the minerals, with the bacteria, with the pathogens all inside the small drop of water, can create its own nano ecosystem. So components is biotic, abiotic, like other definitions. One of the important thing to understand about ecosystem is some abiotic factors. For example, temperature, water, light, and soil. These four abiotic factor is such an important element for ecosystem to run, to create the life, to maintain the interaction, to have these interdependencies among themselves. These four abiotic component is important. Now, the second part of our ecosystem understanding is how ecosystem is giving services to the people in terms of built environment, in terms of rural settings. For example, ecosystem gives four different services to the people. For example, provisioning service in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of biomedical services, transport services, national defense. Everything is part of the provisioning services. It's like a product obtained from ecosystem. Regulating service is something we indirectly get benefit out of the ecosystem. For example, erosion control. Ecosystem can control erosion by, for example, there is a green belt around your city, and this green belt is protecting your city from the cyclones or storm surges. Flood protection, climate regulation, pest controls and pathogen controls part of regulating service. Cultural service is more about non-material benefits obtaining from the ecosystem. For example, from a forest, we can have some educational knowledge. We can have the recreational benefit. We can have the heritage benefit or spiritual benefit. Then supporting service is something which is basically help our ecosystem to sustain for a very long time, for a primary nutrient cycle, for example, or the energy cycle, or biological diversity maintenance, or primary productivity. Ensuring primary productivity is part of support. Some example about provisioning service, that means all the food, fiber, fuel we can get from ecosystem. The example of regulating service, you can see the invasive resistance, or the pollination, seed, climate regulation, disease regulation. These are the service ecosystem is also giving us to make the harmony of the nature. Then this is the example of cultural service. If we go to Alps, or if you go to Andes, if you go to Himalayas, why you go there? You go there for mental relaxation, spiritual benefit, or religious values, or knowledge enhancing your knowledge system. So these are, or the aesthetic value of it can give you the sense of place. This is the service ecology ecosystem is giving as culture. Then lastly, the supporting service, for example, we are inhaling oxygen. It is coming from the ecosystem and is part of the supporting services to run and sustain the species and human habitation. So it can be part of the primary production, provision of habitat, nutrient cycle, and production of atmospheric oxygen and water cycle. This is all part of this supporting services. And this is it for lecture 5. If you have any question, feel free to ask. Thank you.